Hello hunters, welcome back. If you are new here, welcome. You have found yourself in exactly the right place. Pull your blanket a little tighter, settle your head into the pillow, let your breathing slow down, because tonight we are going somewhere most hunters never dare to go. We are going underground, deep underground. Beneath the cobblestone streets of Yharnam, beneath the roots of the healing church, beneath even the memory of the city itself, into a place that was ancient when Yharnam was nothing but an idea in a dead civilization's dreams. Tonight we descend into the Chalice Dungeons. Now, if you have played Bloodborne, you may know the Chalice Dungeons as the optional content, the side area, the part of the game many players skip entirely in favour of the main story, and that is understandable. On the surface they appear to be simply a series of procedurally generated underground levels, stone corridors, torchlight, enemies, bosses, repeat. But that is only the surface, and if you have learned anything from Bloodborne, it is that nothing is only surface. Beneath the surface of everything in this game is another layer of story, of tragedy, of cosmic significance that changes the entire meaning of what you thought you understood. The Chalice Dungeons are not just optional content, they are the oldest content. They are the beginning of everything, every horror that walks the streets of Yharnam on the night of the hunt, every beast that lurches through the fog, every ritual a healing church performs in their grand cathedrals, every cosmic truth that drives scholars mad. All of it has its roots in what is buried beneath those streets. The Chalice Dungeons are a living record of humanity's first and most catastrophic encounter with the Great Ones. They are a civilization's tomb, a god's resting place, and a warning written in stone and blood that nobody ever listened to. So let us listen tonight. Let us go down into the dark, into those ancient corridors, carved by hands that were not quite human, into the oldest places in the Bloodborne world, and let us piece together the full, tragic story that only the dungeons can tell. Let the tension drain from your body. Let the world above fade away. And let me take you somewhere very, very far below. This is the entire lore of the Chalice Dungeons. Every story has a beginning, and the beginning of Bloodborne's story is not Yharnam. It is not Bergenworth. It is not Lawrence or Master Willem or the founding of the Healing Church. The beginning is far, far older than any of that. The beginning is Pthumeru, and the people who built their civilization in the deepest places of the world, the Pthumerians. Even the name sounds ancient, doesn't it? Heavy with age, dense with meaning. Say it slowly and it feels like something from a language that no longer exists, and in many ways it is. By the time any hunter sets foot in Yharnam, the Pthumerians are gone. Not recently gone. Not gone in the way that a civilization collapses and leaves survivors who scatter and rebuild. Gone in the way that only the deepest ruins remain, populated by the undead remnants of their society still carrying out duties they have long since forgotten the purpose of. Gone in the way that a fire goes cold when there is nothing left to burn. But who were they before the end? The item descriptions in the Chalice Dungeons paint a picture that is both fascinating and unsettling. The Pthumerians were superhuman beings. Not humans exactly, though they took a humanoid form, tall, extraordinarily thin, with pale grey skin stretched tight over elongated frames, and faces that wore a permanent expressionless quality, their mouths eternally open as if caught in the middle of a word they never quite finished. They were marked by the eldritch truth, that cosmic awareness of the Great Ones that changes everything it touches, and their appearance reflected this. They had looked upon things no ordinary mind should see, and their very bodies had been reshaped by that contact. The earliest Pthumerians, the oldest and most foundational members of this civilization, began with a simple and sacred purpose. They were guardians, not conquerors, not scholars seeking power, but keepers, caretakers of something vast and sleeping. The great Pthumeru, a hill. Chalice tells us, in its careful language, that early Pthumerians were mere humble guardians of the slumbering Great Ones. That word humble is important. It suggests an original relationship of reverence and service, not ambition, not exploitation. The Pthumerians knew what lay beneath the earth, knew that beings of cosmic magnitude rested in those deep places, and they understood their role: to watch, to maintain, to protect, to keep the tombs of the gods. This is where they lived, in those depths. Not reluctantly, not as a punishment, but by choice and by tradition. The underground labyrinths they carved with their own hands were not prisons but palaces, not dungeons but cities. Vast, sprawling networks of stone corridors and grand chambers, ritual spaces and ceremonial halls, all built in a style that is distinctly Pthumerian. Ornate beyond practical necessity, every surface carved with symbols and patterns, every doorway more elaborate than any utilitarian purpose would require. These were beings who took beauty seriously even deep underground where no sunlight ever penetrated. But humans, and the Pthumerians were close enough to human that the word applies, at least in their earliest form, do not remain humble forever. Power corrupts. Knowledge tempts. The Great Ones they guarded were not merely sleeping statues. They were cosmic entities of incomprehensible power and significance, beings who existed across multiple planes of reality, whose blood carried properties that seemed to violate the natural order. And the Pthumerians, living in proximity to these beings for generations, could not help but learn, could not help but observe, could not help but reach out. The transformation of Pthumerian society is one of the most tragic arcs in all of Bloodborne's lore, precisely because it is so recognizable. It is the story of people who were given a sacred responsibility, who fulfilled it faithfully for a long time, and who then slowly, gradually, in ways they probably told themselves were entirely reasonable, expanded their role from guardian to student to participant to supplicant. They went from watching the Great Ones to worshipping them, from watching to studying, from studying to drinking, because of course they discovered the blood of the Great Ones, even trace amounts of it found in the sacred spaces where these cosmic entities rested, had extraordinary properties. It healed wounds that should have been fatal. It cured diseases that had no earthly remedy. It granted strength and vitality and sharpness of mind that normal human blood simply could not provide. For the Pthumerians, whose entire civilization was built around proximity to the Great Ones, the discovery of the blood's properties must have felt like a divine gift, a reward for their faithful service. And perhaps in some sense it was. Perhaps the Great Ones intended this. Perhaps they were using the Pthumerians all along for their own inscrutable purposes. Or perhaps the Pthumerians simply took without asking, as people tend to do when something miraculous is readily available. Blood ministration, the ritual of administering the Great One's blood to individuals for healing and empowerment. This was not invented by Lawrence or the Healing Church. It was not discovered at Bergenworth. It was discovered here in these ancient corridors by a civilization that had been sitting on top of the source for longer than Yharnam has existed. The Pthumerians were doing everything the Healing Church would later do, thousands of years before the Healing Church existed. They were the original blood ministers, the original believers, and they paid the original price. Because the blood that heals also changes, the blood that empowers also transforms, and the Pthumerians, who had been changed once already by their contact with the Eldritch Truth, were changed again by sustained blood ministration. Some of them ascended, some of them became something more than they had been, their awareness expanding, their capabilities growing, their understanding of the universe deepening in ways that were simultaneously transcendent and deeply alien. Others descended, others became beasts consumed by the animal aspect of the blood, their humanity eroding beneath the pressure of cosmic corruption. This is the first instance of the scourge of beasts, not in Yharnam, not in old Yharnam, but here, in these underground corridors, thousands of years before the city above was even imagined, the Pthumerians experienced everything Yharnam would later experience: the miraculous healing, the gradual transformation, the beast plague, the catastrophic collapse. All of it happening first in the dark, watched only by the Great Ones who may or may not have cared about what they were witnessing. And as Pthumerian society evolved and stratified, a new role emerged. The descendants of the original guardians, who had built their civilization and named their capital after one of their queens, elevated a single ruler to serve as their foremost communicator with the Great Ones. Not a king, notably, a queen. The monarchy of Pthumeru was traditionally female, and this was no coincidence, because the Great Ones desired children, and the most sacred role a Pthumerian queen could fulfill was to serve as a vessel, a medium, a living bridge between the human world and the cosmic one. Their bodies were the point of connection. Their blood was the currency of communion. The Pthumerian queens took names of classical roots, formal titles that carried the weight of their civilization's religious significance. And the last of these queens, the one whose name would eventually be given to a city built above her tomb, was a woman whose tragedy would echo across thousands of years of Bloodborne's history. Her name was Yharnam, and her story is at the very heart of everything the Chalice Dungeons contain. But before we descend to that heart, we need to understand the architecture of the dungeon system itself. We need to understand the 4 distinct realms that the Holy Chalices unlock, because each one tells a different part of the oldest story, and each one reveals something essential about the world that existed before Yharnam was ever built. An enormous labyrinth stretching beneath the entire region of Yharnam, not just beneath the city, but beneath the surrounding countryside, beneath the fields and forests and coastal cliffs, a vast underground network of interconnected corridors and chambers spanning a distance that staggers comprehension. This is the old labyrinth, the collective term for what the Chalice Dungeons represent, and it is not a single unified structure, but rather a network of distinct regions, each with their own character, their own history, their own particular flavour of ancient darkness. The Holy Chalices are the keys to this network, physical objects, ceremonial cups that have been imbued through ancient Pthumerian ritual with the power to break the seals on specific sections of the old labyrinth. Each chalice corresponds to a region, and combining the chalice with the proper ritual materials at an altar in the hunter's dream creates a passage downward, a connection to a specific area of this underground world. The Healing Church discovered this system when they began exploring the ruins beneath Bergenworth, and they have been sending tomb prospectors, hunters specifically tasked with exploring these dungeons, into the depths ever since. Most of them do not come back, or they come back changed. There are 4 primary regions accessible through the chalice system, and each tells a distinctly different story. The first and most central of these is Pthumeru, the Pthumerian Chalice Dungeons. This is the oldest section, the original heart of Pthumerian civilization, the place where the labyrinth began. Pthumeru is where the Pthumerians built their primary settlements and ritual spaces, and it is the most intact of the dungeon regions. By intact, I do not mean undamaged. Nothing in these dungeons is truly undamaged, but Pthumeru retains the most structure, the most evidence of the civilization that built it. The architecture here is at its most ornate, most deliberate. Grand stone doorways carved with intricate patterns, wide corridors designed to accommodate ceremony and procession, not just passage. Ritual chambers where the remnants of ceremonies conducted thousands of years ago are still visible in the layout and decoration of the space. Pthumeru is also, notably, where the undead Pthumerians are most concentrated. And these are not mindless animated corpses shuffling through dark corridors. These are the oldest of the Pthumerians, beings who underwent a peculiar ritual, the ceremony of flame, which cremated both body and soul together in an act that was meant to grant eternal vigilance. The keeper sets found in the dungeons, adorned with what appears to be bone ash, belong to these individuals. They chose to burn themselves, willingly, so that they could remain as eternal guardians in an ashen, immortal form. Thousands of years later, they are still there, still watching, still fulfilling their duty with the stubborn fidelity of beings who have forgotten everything except their purpose. The Pthumerian soldiers, the ranged combatants, the warriors who patrol the corridors, these were the human members of Pthumerian society, the Watchers, who continue to expand the Hintertombs even now, digging new corridors and filling them with graves in an act of purposeful labour, long since stripped of any organisational authority directing it. They dig because they have always dug. They watch because they have always watched. The society that commanded them is gone, but the command remains, encoded so deeply into their existence that even death and the passage of millennia cannot erase it. The deepest section of Pthumeru leads eventually to Pthumeru Isz, the capital city. The capital of a civilization so old that even the Healing Church, which has had centuries to study these dungeons, barely understands what they are looking at. It is here, at the very bottom of Pthumeru's depths, that the final Pthumerian queen waits. We will descend to her in time. The second region is the Hintertomb, smaller, less ornate, more functional in its design. The Hintertomb represents the peripheral catacombs of the labyrinth, the outer edges of Pthumerian underground territory. Where Pthumeru itself was the civic and ritual heart of the civilization, the Hintertomb served a different purpose. It was the burial ground, the place where the dead were laid to rest in less ceremonious fashion. The Hintertomb Chalice description tells us with unusual directness that the Hintertombs are unceremonious catacombs filled with graves and death. And it mentions something remarkable. To this day, the Watchers continue to expand the Hintertombs, To this day. Not historically, not in the past. Now. The Watchers, those undead labourers of Pthumerian civilization, are actively still digging, still expanding, still adding to the burial network long after anyone has died who might need burying there. They have continued their work for thousands of years because they were never told to stop. There is no authority left to give the order, so they dig. And the Hintertombs grow, room by room, corridor by corridor, an ever-expanding necropolis in the dark. The Hintertomb is home to some particularly unsettling enemies. The eye collectors, those hunched, eyeless figures who nonetheless seem guided by some terrible sense toward their prey, are connected to the witchcraft practices that emerged in this peripheral section of the labyrinth. The Witch of Hemwick, that peculiar boss encountered in the main game of Bloodborne, appears to have strong connections to the Hintertomb. Her obsession with collecting eyes, her ability to channel arcane power, the fact that the bloodshot eyeballs she leaves behind are actually ritual materials used to unlock the Hintertomb seals. All of this suggests that the Witches of Hemwick are descended from, or directly connected to, the Pthumerian practitioners who operated in this outer region of the labyrinth, a community that found its way to the surface at some point and established itself in the outskirts of what would become Yharnam, carrying their underground traditions upward into the daylight world, while never quite leaving the underground behind. The third region is Loran, and Loran is where Bloodborne's story becomes genuinely haunting in a new and different way. Loran is not part of Pthumeru proper. It is a separate land, a separate civilization, accessible through certain chalices but geographically distinct from the Pthumerian heartland. The ailing Loran chalice gives us the description in its heartbreaking simplicity. Loran is a tragic land that was devoured by the sands, and the tragedy that struck this ailing land of Loran is said to have its root in the scourge of the beast, and then, most ominously of all, some have made the dreaded extrapolation that Yharnam will be next. Loran was not a Pthumerian city, but it was connected to the Pthumerian world. It had its own civilization, its own people, who discovered the old blood and practiced their own form of blood ministration. And just as the Pthumerians before them, just as Yharnam after them, the civilization of Loran was destroyed by the scourge of beasts that inevitably follows when the old blood is used with ambition and without wisdom. Unlike Pthumeru, which collapsed gradually, Loran's end was total and environmental. The city was literally swallowed by sand. Desert consumed it. The ground itself buried Loran beneath layers of arid destruction that speak to something catastrophic, something beyond just social collapse, a landscape in mourning for what it once contained, or actively hostile to any memory of it. When hunters descend into the Loran Chalice Dungeons, they find an environment dramatically different from Pthumeru. The air is hot and dry. Static electricity crackles through the corridors. The sounds are different, drier and more desolate. The beasts here are different too, more advanced in their transformation, suggesting that the scourge has been working on them for much longer than the scourge in Yharnam has had to work on its victims. The Loran silver beasts are almost certainly Pthumerians or Loranians, who have been transformed over thousands of years into something barely recognizable as having once been sentient. And at the deepest levels of Loran dwells the Loran Dark Beast, an immense creature crackling with lightning, a being of pure electricity and destruction that represents perhaps the final stage of what a beast becomes when it has been a beast for long enough with nothing to limit its transformation. Loran's dungeon also contains trace remains of medical procedures. This detail, given without further explanation, is devastating in its implications. The people of Loran knew the scourge was happening. They tried to treat it. Surgically, medically, whatever techniques were available to them. And those techniques failed completely, as evidenced by the fact that Loran is a city of sand and beasts with nothing living left within it. The medical procedures were either attempts to control the scourge or the cause of the outbreak, and the uncertainty of that statement is deliberate. We do not know which. Maybe neither distinction is meaningful. Maybe when you are dealing with the old blood, the cause and the attempt to cure become indistinguishable from each other. The fourth region is the most alien, the most cosmically significant, and in some ways the most important to understanding the deep history of what the Great Ones actually are. This is Isz. The Isz gravestone, the description of the Isz Chalice Dungeon, tells us something extraordinary. According to the choir, the land of Isz lies in contact with the cosmos, which allowed the Great Ones who resided there to function on transcendental planes of thought. In contact with the cosmos, not just underground, not just ancient, but touching the cosmos directly, the vast outer reaches of reality where the Great Ones originate and where their truest existence resides. Isz is the place where the boundary between the underground world and the cosmic dimension becomes thin enough to cross or to see through. The atmosphere in the Isz Chalice Dungeons is unlike any other area in Bloodborne. The walls and ceilings are translucent in places, allowing glimpses of what appears to be deep space, the vast darkness of the cosmos punctuated by distant nebulae and star formations visible through the stone itself. It is beautiful and deeply disturbing, the way the most terrifying things often are. The Great Ones who inhabit Isz did not descend from somewhere else. They were here. They have always been here, functioning on these transcendental planes of thought, existing in Isz because Isz is close enough to their natural dimensional space that they can maintain a physical presence. And it was through the Greatest Chalice that the Healing Church's choir made their first real face-to-face contact with the living Great One. It was in Isz that they found Ebrietas, the daughter of the cosmos, abandoned and mourning in the deepest reaches of this cosmic border region. But we will return to Ebrietas. Her story deserves its own careful telling. These four regions, Pthumeru, Hintertomb, Loran and Isz, form the complete picture of the underground world that the Chalice Dungeons preserve. Each one is a different chapter in the same ongoing tragedy. Pthumeru is where the story began. Loran is where the same story played out again in a different location with the same results. Isz is where the cosmic layer of the story lives, where the Great One's side of events is most visible. And the Hintertomb is where the administrative machinery of a dead civilization continues to operate mindlessly in the absence of anyone to direct it. Together they are a museum of catastrophe, an archive of civilizations that reached too far, learned too much, and paid the price that has always been associated with that particular transgression in Bloodborne's world. And at the centre of this museum, at the heart of Pthumeru's deepest levels, is the story of a queen, and a god, and an infant, and a contract made in blood that can never be broken or undone. Before we descend to Queen Yharnam and the tragedy at the centre of everything, it is worth pausing in the middle corridors of the Pthumerian labyrinth to understand who we encounter there, because the dungeons are not empty, they are very much inhabited, and the beings who inhabit them tell us as much about Pthumerian civilization as any architectural detail or item description. The Watchers are perhaps the most ubiquitous presence in the Chalice Dungeons. You encounter them almost immediately, clustered in groups of 3 or 4, bearing an assortment of weapons ranging from enormous cleavers to firearms fashioned in a distinctly different style from Yharnam's Victorian-era weaponry. These Watchers are the remnants of Pthumerian society's working class, its soldiers and labourers, and they have been here for so long that the concept of a chain of command has become entirely abstract to them. They follow orders that were given thousands of years ago by authorities that no longer exist, directed by purpose that has outlasted any understanding of what that purpose was for. And yet they are not mindless. There is coordination in how they move. There is strategy in how they position themselves. A Watcher with a firearm will hang back while cleaver-wielding Watchers press forward. They work as a team in the way that soldiers work as a team, operating from deeply ingrained tactical training that has survived the collapse of everything else. If you watch them long enough, before they notice you, you can see something almost sad in their coordination. It is diligence without direction, discipline without cause. The Pthumerian soldiers and archers are different from the Watchers. These are warrior castes, the Pthumerian equivalents of Yharnam's hunters, beings who bore exceptional martial ability during their lives, and who have retained something of that expertise even in their current state. The Pthumerian descendant, one of the bosses encountered in the dungeons, is a particularly striking example. A lithe, acrobatic fighter who moves with the speed and grace of someone who spent a lifetime mastering their art, leaping and spinning through combat in ways that seem almost elegant. Their skill has not diminished, only their context has been erased. They fight because they are fighters, in the same way that the Watchers dig because they are diggers. The keepers of the old lords are different again, and they are among the most thematically rich beings in the entire dungeon system. These are Pthumerians who underwent the ceremony of flame, that ritual cremation of body and soul together, and who have existed in their ashen immortal state for so long that they have become something barely recognizable as having once been living beings. They appear as armored figures, their bodies surrounded by a continuous internal fire, their flesh and bone transformed through the ritual into something that burns perpetually without being consumed. They carry torches and other fire-related implements, and they can command the flames around them with practiced ease. The Keeper's set, the armour they wear, is described as having been scorched in a vast flame for a ritual purpose, cremating both body and soul. And the item description adds something that gives the whole practice a different character. The Keepers gained an eternal life, yet as an ashen form, being a result of a ceremony of flame. Eternal life. But what sort of life is eternal consciousness in an ashen form, patrolling the same corridors forever, in service to guardians who have long since ceased to exist? The Keepers gained exactly what they sought, immortality in service of the Great Ones, and the cost was everything that made that service meaningful. They are eternal and they are alone, their civilization gone, their Great Ones either departed or sleeping so deeply they do not respond, their purpose unchanged even as the world that gave it purpose has vanished. The watchdog of the old lords is perhaps the most visually striking guardian in the dungeons, an enormous canine beast its flesh so deeply and repeatedly seared by its own internal flames that large portions of skin and muscle have burned away, leaving bones exposed and blackened. It is fire-made animal, and despite its horrifying appearance, it has the same fundamental character as every other guardian in these dungeons. It is doing its job, protecting the old lords it was set to protect, maintaining a vigil over a sleeping that has lasted millennia. Then there are the brain suckers, those grotesque humanoid figures with swollen eye-covered skulls who drain the insight of any hunter they grapple with. The brain suckers represent a horrifying endpoint of a path that Master Willem at Bergenworth was attempting to follow. They have lined their skulls with eyes, have achieved the external physical manifestation of what Willem sought through internal transformation. They can perceive things beyond normal human vision. They just cannot do anything useful with that perception anymore. Reduced to instinctive ambush predators in dark corridors, the insight they steal from hunters does not benefit them. It simply denies it to others. They are a cautionary example of what happens when the quest for greater perception becomes the only thing driving a being's existence. And then there are the Bell Maidens. These figures, women in simple robes ringing small bells, are among the most disconcerting enemies in the dungeon system. Their bells summon additional enemies from the outer darkness, pulling creatures from somewhere beyond the visible world into the physical space of the dungeon. Where do these creatures come from? The Bell Maiden's ringing suggests a correspondence system, a means of communication between the physical dungeon and some adjacent realm, possibly a nightmare, possibly some other dimensional space where the overflow of the dungeon's violence has accumulated. The Bell Maidens are specialists in maintaining this connection, and they will ring until they are stopped. All of these beings together paint a picture of Pthumerian civilization's final state, a society of specialists continuing their specialized functions in the complete absence of the societal structure that those functions were meant to serve. It is, in its own quiet way, one of the most poignant things in the game. A civilization so thoroughly committed to its purpose that even extinction could not stop it from trying. Let us spend a little more time in Loran, because Loran deserves careful attention. It is not just another ruined civilization. It is the clearest warning that anyone in Bloodborne's world could have had, and it was ignored completely by everyone who came after. Think about the timing from Yharnam's perspective. When the scholars of Bergenworth began exploring the Chalice Dungeons, they found Pthumeru, ancient, ruined, populated by undead guardians of a collapsed civilization. That alone should have given them pause. But they also had access through the Loran Chalice to an entirely separate ruined civilization that had clearly gone through exactly the same cycle, in exactly the same way, and ended in exactly the same catastrophic destruction. Two civilizations, same result, same cause, same ending. And the Loran Chalice literally tells them, the tragedy that struck this ailing land of Loran is said to have its roots in the scourge of the beast. And then, the most explicit warning in the entire game, some have made the dreaded extrapolation that Yharnam will be next. Someone, some scholar of the Healing Church, understood the pattern, understood that what they were looking at in Loran was a future they were building toward with their own hands, and then they either did nothing with that understanding, or they were overruled, or the warning was buried in a dungeon description and never taken seriously. Loran was not small. to have a chalice system dedicated to it, to have multiple layers of dungeons, to have a dark beast as its deepest boss. Loran was a significant civilization. It had its own architecture, its own culture, its own relationship with blood and with the Great Ones. The environmental storytelling in Loran's dungeons suggests a city that in many ways resembled what old Yharnam would become. A dense urban environment that was overrun by the scourge from within, its inhabitants transforming in waves until there was nothing left that could be called a civilization. The trace remains of medical procedures are haunting precisely because they represent the same futile attempts that would later play out in Yharnam. Someone in Loran understood that the transformations were happening. Someone set up surgical procedures, tried to intervene physically, attempted to treat the scourge as a medical problem with medical solutions, and it failed, completely and utterly, just as similar attempts would fail in Yharnam thousands of years later when the healing church tried bloodletting and isolation and burning entire districts. But Loran's most significant contribution to Bloodborne's mythology is the beasts it has produced over the millennia. The Loran Silver Beast is a creature that has been a beast for so long it has developed what appear to be elemental abilities, a connection to electricity that runs through its fur and bones that has no natural explanation other than the passage of extraordinary amounts of time. The Loran Dark Beast takes this further still, a creature so transformed by age and the scourge that it has become something barely recognizable as having once been related to the wolves and canines that the scourge typically produces in its first stages. It is vast. It crackles with constant lightning. It moves with a speed that seems impossible for its size. The Loran Dark Beast is, in a sense, what the scourge looks like when it has had thousands of years to work uninterrupted. Yharnam's beasts are in the early stages. They are recognizable, mostly humanoid or lupine, still bearing traces of the people they were. The Loran Dark Beast shows where that road leads, given enough time. It shows that the scourge does not stop at a certain stage of transformation. It keeps going, and going, and going, until what remains has shed every trace of its original form and become something that exists at the intersection of beast and lightning and deep time. Think about what the Loran Dark Beast represents in terms of the timeline. If the scourge in Loran began perhaps 3,000 or 4,000 years before the events of Bloodborne, and if the Dark Beast has been transforming continuously since then what we are fighting in the dungeon is the result of millennia of uninterrupted becoming. It is not a beast in the way that the cleric beast or the blood-starved beast are beasts, creatures in the midst of transformation, still carrying traces of the forms they came from. The Loran Dark Beast is a beast that has arrived somewhere. That has completed a journey no beast in Yharnam has yet finished. The electricity that surrounds it is not incidental, not a quirk of its individual transformation, but a property that emerges when the scourge runs long enough. It is what the scourge becomes when you give it enough time and enough solitude. Pure elemental violence, pure transformed energy. A beast so completely beast that it has started to become something else entirely on the other side of the concept. The bastards of Loran deserve a mention too, those horrifying items found in the dungeons. Mummified remains of infant Loran silver beasts formed in the womb of women infected with the beast scourge. The scourge transformed people so thoroughly that it transformed what they could produce as well. Babies born to transformed mothers were not human babies, and were not fully transformed beasts either, but something caught in between, a biological dead end preserved in mummification in the corridors of the labyrinth. They are used as ritual materials by the Healing Church, who finds practical application for even the most horrible things if those things can advance their knowledge. Loran also tells us something about the Great One's relationship to the civilization there, or rather the absence of that relationship. Unlike Pthumeru, where the Pthumerians at least had direct contact with and proximity to Great Ones, Loran appears to have been a civilization that stumbled into the old blood without the benefit of that proximity. There are no signs of Great Ones having been resident in Loran, no keeper figures performing eternal ceremonies, no evidence of the same level of cosmic contact that Pthumeru maintained. Loran found the blood, used the blood, and experienced the consequences without ever achieving the deeper communion that was supposedly the goal. They got all of the cost and none of the transcendence. What killed Loran physically, what literally buried it in sand, is never explained. Natural disaster seems insufficient to account for a city being completely swallowed. Perhaps the scourge's transformation of the environment itself, perhaps the anger of Great Ones disturbed by what was happening there, perhaps something even less explicable operating on principles that human language cannot adequately capture. Loran is gone, and it left nothing behind except its dungeons and its beasts and a warning that everyone chose to ignore. And now we must go where even most of the Healing Church's scholars have never been. We must descend into Isz. The Great Isz Chalice is one of the most significant artifacts in Bloodborne's world, and its significance is almost entirely related to what it unlocked and who it led the choir to find there. Since the time of Bergenworth, the choir description tells us, the Great Isz Chalice was the first to be brought to the surface, and it allowed the choir to have audience with Ebrietas. It became the cornerstone of the choir, the elite delegation of the Healing Church. Cornerstone. That word matters. Everything the choir did, all of their research into cosmic ascension, all of their experiments with celestial emissaries, all of their attempts to transcend humanity through insight rather than beast transformation, all of it was built on the foundation of what they found in Isz, and what they found in Isz was a Great One who had been left behind. Ebrietas. The name means something, like excessive sorrow or excessive gloom in the Latin-adjacent language that Bloodborne uses for its significant terms. Daughter of the cosmos, found in the depths of Isz, in the deepest reaches of the dungeon where the walls become translucent and the cosmos bleeds through, mourning alone at an altar over what appears to be a fossilized corpse, perhaps the body of another Great One, perhaps a child she had and lost, following the universal pattern that every Great One seems to enact eventually. Every Great One loses its child and then yearns for a surrogate. Ebrietas had been abandoned. The Augur of Ebrietas, a hunter tool that allows partial summoning of her form, describes her as abandoned Ebrietas. And the choir description, in its careful phrasing, tells us that together with the left-behind Great One, they look to the skies in search of astral signs that may lead them to the rediscovery of true greatness. The choir and Ebrietas had goals that aligned. Both were searching. The Isz choir was looking for the Great Ones, for cosmic truth, for transcendence. Ebrietas was looking for whoever had departed, for whatever she had lost, for something she could not name but could feel as an absence that the human concepts of loneliness and grief barely begin to capture. When the choir discovered Ebrietas, they may have believed that they had finally had the breakthrough they needed. A living Great One, present and apparently accessible, willing to allow communion, willing to share what she knew or could teach. The greatest chalice became the cornerstone of everything because it was the literal doorway to this relationship. And the relationship was real. Ebrietas did share things with the choir. The arcane blood of Ebrietas was used in their most advanced ministrations. Her presence enabled their most sophisticated research. The Augur of Ebrietas and A Call Beyond, 2 hunter tools that channel cosmic arcane energy, exist because of knowledge derived from the choir's communion with her. But what the choir's discovery of Ebrietas also revealed was something disturbing about the nature of the Great Ones themselves. At some point in history, there had been a mass departure. Ebrietas was left behind because something happened to the majority of Great Ones that resulted in their absence from this world. They are gone, wherever Great Ones go when they leave a plane of existence. And the one left behind is mourning them. She's not the last of her kind in the sense of extinction. She is the one who was left, which implies that leaving was something the others did together, possibly deliberately, possibly in response to some event or decision that Ebrietas was not part of or was not taken away with. Being left behind by your own kind, by the only beings in existence who share your nature, while the world around you is populated by creatures so far beneath your level of existence that meaningful connection seems impossible. This is Ebrietas's existence. This is what the choir found when they descended into Isz. The Isz dungeon itself is extraordinary. Walking through it is unlike walking through any other part of Bloodborne's world. The architecture is Pthumerian in its basic form, but altered by proximity to the cosmic boundary. Nebulae and star formations are visible through the translucent walls and ceilings. The enemies here are almost entirely kin, creatures that are not beasts, not ordinary humans, not even Pthumerians, but beings that have been touched by cosmic influence and elevated or altered into something adjacent to the Great Ones. Brain suckers, celestial emissaries, living failures, all gathered in this space where the boundary between the physical world and the cosmic dimension is at its thinnest. The final boss of the Isz Chalice dungeon is Ebrietas herself, found here as well as in the main game's upper cathedral ward. The existence of 2 Ebrietas encounters raises interesting questions. Is the Isz encounter a different version of her, an earlier self, a projection? Or is killing the Great One in the main game truly death or merely displacement back to the dimensional space they naturally inhabit? The theory that Great Ones do not truly die but are simply returned to their higher dimensional existence when their physical forms are destroyed is supported by the continuing functionality of the Augur of Ebrietas after her defeat in the main game. She is gone from physical presence, but she is not simply nothing. She is returned to wherever Great Ones go when the physical anchors that hold them are severed. Standing in the deepest part of Isz, looking up through those translucent walls at the cosmos beyond, it is difficult not to feel the full weight of what Bloodborne is saying about the relationship between humanity and the Great Ones. There is no equivalent relationship in these dungeon depths, no communication, no warning. The cosmos is simply there, vast and indifferent, and Ebrietas is there with it, mourning losses too large and too alien for human minds to comprehend, and the Pthumerian labyrinth is there below everything, a memorial to all the small, mortal attempts to reach up and touch something that exists at a scale which makes those attempts seem heartbreaking in their smallness. Now we reach the deepest level, the most sacred space, the place that the entire dungeon system has been building toward, layer by layer, corridor by corridor, boss fight by boss fight. We reach the great Pthumerian Chalice. We reach the capital of the Pthumerian civilization, and at the bottom of that capital, chained in her wedding dress with her hands bound and her body visibly pregnant, we find Queen Yharnam. She is not what most hunters expect when they finally reach her after the long journey through multiple dungeons. She is not monstrous in the way the dungeon bosses typically are. She is distinctly, recognizably human in her silhouette, in her bearing, in the white wedding dress that has become stained with the blood of the child in her womb. She wears a veil, her hands are chained, and throughout the entire encounter, from the moment you enter the chamber, you can hear a baby crying. Mergo, even here, even now, before the child was taken, even in this memory of before, the crying never stops. The wedding dress is significant in Bloodborne's world in a way that goes beyond ordinary symbolism. The ring of betrothal, a rare item found in the deepest Pthumerian dungeons, carries a description that reframes what marriage meant in the Age of the Great Ones. The inhuman beings known as the Great Ones imbued this ring with some special meaning. In the Age of the Great Ones, wedlock was a blood contract, only permitted to those slated to bear a special child. Marriage in this context was not about romantic partnership or social alliance. It was a sacred contract with the Great One, entered into by a woman chosen to carry a divine child. Yharnam wearing a wedding dress means that she was the chosen vessel. Her marriage was to Eden. Her child was Mergo. Whedon, the formless Great One. Among all the cosmic entities in Bloodborne, Whedon is perhaps the most conceptually unique. He is described as formless, transcending the need for any sort of physical manifestation, instead existing as only voice and influence. He does not have a body. He does not appear because there is nothing to appear. He exists as the utterance of words, as the influence of intention on the world, as the invisible pressure of cosmic will. The chapel dedicated to him in Cathedral Ward, the chapel that serves as a hub for the game's early hours, is named for a being who cannot be seen or depicted, which is why the statues there depict other things, and the Great One himself is simply an absence. Odin is worshipped by many in Yharnam without their knowledge of it. The old blood that flows through the city, ministered by the healing church, carries Whedon's essence. All who consume blood, all who participate in blood ministration, are indirectly in communion with the formless Great One because Whedon is present. Wherever blood is present in quantity, he is the god of blood without a body, exerting influence on a world he cannot physically occupy. This is why the Erdon Rith rune, found as the game, produces additional blood bullets. It is literally the rune associated with the Great One who exists within blood itself. The third umbilical cord description associated with Ariana's child tells us, with devastating clarity, the nature of Udin's interest in Yharnam. Every Great One loses its child, and then yearns for a surrogate, and Eden, the formless Great One, is no different. To think it was corrupted blood that began this eldritch liaison. So Eden sought surrogates. He found them through the blood he inhabits, through the women whose blood was particularly compatible with his essence. And Yharnam, the Pthumerian queen, was the first and most significant of these. Her blood was especially potent, powerful enough that other Pthumerians considered it an honor to receive it, and powerful enough to serve as the vessel for something previously impossible: the birth of a child who was simultaneously human and Great One. The nature of how this came to pass is deliberately ambiguous. It was a blood contract, a blood wedding, which in the context of Bloodborne suggests something deeply ritualistic, and not necessarily something Yharnam chose in the way we understand personal choice. She was the queen. She was the one whose blood was most potent. She was the one chosen by whatever process the Pthumerian civilization used to identify their sacred vessels. Whether this was an honor she embraced, a duty she accepted, or an imposition she had no power to refuse is not clear, and the ambiguity feels intentional. The red stains on her white wedding dress, the chains on her hands, suggest that her condition was not entirely voluntary. She was used. She was a vessel chosen and controlled by forces, cosmic and societal, larger than herself, Murgo, the child who resulted from this union between the Pthumerian queen and the formless Great One. Murgo is an infant Great One, which means Murgo is both human and cosmic, born from a human body but inheriting the nature of the Great One who fathered them. The third umbilical cord tells us that every Great One loses its child. Murgo follows this pattern. The pregnancy ended in what appears to have been a stillbirth. The physical body of the child died before or at the moment of birth, but because of Murgo's Great One nature, the child's consciousness persisted, could not simply stop existing the way a human child's would. Found itself in the nightmare of menses instead, crying alone, attended by the wet nurse, trapped in a dream dimension that the school of Mensis would later stumble into and be consumed by. When you fight Queen Yharnam in the depths of Pthumeru Hill, you are fighting her in a moment that exists outside normal time. She is still pregnant. The battle has not yet happened. The child has not yet been taken. This is a memory, or a time echo, or a pocket of reality where the worst moment of her story is frozen in perpetual repetition. You fight her, and she splits into 3 versions. The copies less bloody than the original, all attacking together in a way that reads as a queen defending herself against something she knows is coming and cannot stop. The baby's cries intensify at certain moments, can actually interrupt attacks, as if Murgo is participating in the fight, as if the child within her is already a presence distinct from and beyond the mother who carries it. When you defeat her, you receive the Yharnam Stone, an item that resembles a lithopedion, a calcified or stone baby, the physical remnant of a child that was taken, transformed by grief and time into something dense and cold and permanent, a mother's souvenir of a child she lost. The most haunting item in a game full of haunting items, but the tragedy does not end with the defeat. The second time you encounter Queen Yharnam is after you defeat Murgo's wet nurse in the Nightmare of Mensis, when you have in some sense freed Murgo from the nightmare, from the captivity that the Mensis scholars created by forcing contact with the child. She is standing at the top of the stairs watching, and when you return to her after the fight she bows, not a bow of submission or of defeat, a bow of gratitude. Her child has been freed. Her vigil can end. The queen who was chained and used and robbed of her child bows to the hunter who, in killing the guardian of her child's prison, offered some form of release. It is one of the most quietly devastating moments in the game. No cutscene, no dialogue, just a gesture, a bow, and then she is gone. Before we continue into the next chapter of this story, I want to take a moment to say thank you. If you have made it this far into the depths of the Chalice Dungeons with me, you're exactly the kind of listener this channel exists for. If you are enjoying this deep dive, please consider subscribing to Nightfall Lore and leaving a comment below. Your thoughts on this content genuinely shape what we explore next. Now, back underground. There is still so much further we need to go. Understanding the Chalice Dungeons requires understanding how they were rediscovered, because the story of Bergenworth's exploration of the old labyrinth is the story of exactly how the tragedy of Pthumeru and Loran was transferred upward into the healing church and into Yharnam itself. The scholars of Bergenworth were serious academics in the tradition of their era, drawn to knowledge with the genuine passion that the best scholars always demonstrate, and the fatal blindness to consequence that too often accompanies it. When they discovered entrances to the old labyrinth, which the Pthumerians themselves had partially sealed, and which sat beneath the Bergenworth grounds and the surrounding region, they recognized immediately that they had found something extraordinary. They called them the tombs of the gods, which was both accurate and a sign of how they were framing what they found. Not the ruins of the dead, not a warning written in collapsed stone. The tombs of the gods, treasure to be uncovered. They sent prospectors downward. The tomb prospector hood tells us that the healing church traces its roots to Bergenworth, and is therefore aware of the ruins' true importance. They contain much more than mere hunter trinkets. Indeed, they hide the very secrets of the old Great Ones, sought after by those with the insight to imagine greatness. That language, those with the insight to imagine greatness, reveals the attitude with which they approached the dungeons. This was not cautious investigation, this was aspiration. They wanted what the Pthumerians had found. They wanted to achieve what the Pthumerians had achieved. Master Willem, the head of Bergenworth, was more cautious than most. His approach to the dungeons and to the old blood found within them was consistent with his overall philosophy of gaining insight rather than physical transformation. He wanted to understand. He wanted to perceive. He counselled restraint, warned against the blind. Consumption of the old blood feared what reckless use would produce. Fear the old blood, and his phrase, his warning, the three words that sum up everything he understood about what the dungeons contained. But the dungeons were also where the scholars found the things that split Bergenworth apart. The old blood, evidence of blood ministration, evidence of Great One contact, evidence that the Pthumerians had achieved remarkable things through these practices. And for a scholar like Lawrence, who had less patience for Willem's caution and more ambition for immediate tangible results, the dungeons were proof that the healing church he was already imagining was possible. That blood ministration worked, that the ascension the Pthumerians had achieved could be achieved again. The fact that the Pthumerians no longer existed to demonstrate their success apparently registered as irrelevant detail. The scholars also found Ebrietas in the Isz Chalice dungeon, and this discovery, the discovery of an actual living Great One, was transformative for those who encountered her. Here was direct evidence that the Great Ones could be communicated with, that they would allow proximity, that they could serve as the source of cosmic knowledge the scholars were seeking. The choir, the highest delegation of the healing church that grew from Bergenworth's schism, would build their entire research program around Ebrietas. around the relationship that the Isz chalice had made possible, and the scholars found traces of blood that could be extracted and studied, blood that made its way to the surface and eventually into the systems of blood ministration that the healing church would develop. The blood administered to the citizens of Yharnam was old blood from the dungeons below, mixed and refined and distributed as medicine. Every person who received blood ministration in Yharnam was being given something that was ancient, that had already destroyed at least 2 civilizations that carried within it the seeds of the same transformation that had emptied Loran of living inhabitants and left Pthumeru populated only by the undead. Some of the scholars who went into the dungeons for Bergenworth and the early healing church never came back. Some came back changed. Some came back with exactly what they sought: fragments of the old blood, pieces of arcane knowledge, glimpses of Great One truth that they had to process and organize before they could make use of. And some came back with questions they could not stop asking. Questions that the dungeons had planted in them the way seeds are planted in soil. Questions that would grow and consume them if they were not answered. The healing church inherited all of this, the knowledge and the warnings both, the achievements and the failures both, and chose, with the institutional arrogance that characterizes every powerful organization that has ever decided its goals justify whatever means are required, to take the knowledge and ignore the warnings. Among all the Chalice Dungeon variations, one stands apart for the unique and brutal form of punishment it inflicts on those who enter it. The Cursed and Defiled Chalice, also known as the Cursed Pthumeru Defilement, cuts the maximum health of any hunter who enters it in half. Not through enemy attacks or environmental damage, simply by existing within the space. The dungeon itself diminishes you. The very air of it erodes your capacity to endure harm. This is thematically rich in ways that deserve consideration. The defiled dungeons are cursed spaces. The description tells us they are dungeons in which hunters' health is greatly eroded, and the cursor materializes this through a mechanic that removes half of your health simply for being present. In a game where every resource matters and every combat is already dangerous, entering a defiled chalice is entering a space where the normal rules of survival have been altered against you. Bosses that were manageable become potentially fatal. Enemies that were threatening become genuinely terrifying. The dungeon is harder not because the enemies are stronger, but because you are weaker, because the space itself has decided to diminish you. The lore implication is that defilement in Bloodborne's context is a consequence of angering the Great Ones. Curses are caused by inciting the anger of the Great Ones, and the defiled dungeons are spaces where that anger has been crystallized into the environment itself. Something happened here that upset the cosmic balance, and the punishment for that transgression is woven into the physics of the place. Every hunter who enters pays for a transgression they did not personally commit, inheriting the consequences of ancient violations the way the city of Yharnam inherits the consequences of the healing church's choices made before any current citizen was born. The boss of the defiled chalice is the watchdog of the old lords, that enormous flaming beast with its exposed bones and its perpetual internal fire. Encountering it in a space where your health is halved transforms it from a difficult but manageable encounter into something genuinely terrifying. And this is appropriate, because the watchdog is itself a guardian over something ancient and sacred. protecting the old lords in a dungeon space that was already punishing you for being there at all. Two forms of hostility, the environmental and the personal, combining in a space designed to make clear that your presence is unwelcome, that this is not a place you are meant to visit, that the information and the items and the advancement available here comes with a cost built into the architecture itself. The defiled dungeons also contain the amygdala as a boss fight, which is significant because the amygdala in the main game are visible only to those with sufficient insight. They cling to the buildings of Yharnam, giant spider-like great ones watching everything with their many eyes only, perceptible to those who have seen enough cosmic truth to perceive them. In the defiled chalice, the amygdala is fully present, fully visible, fully engaged in combat with you. Its presence there rather than in the undefiled sections suggests that the defilement, the cosmic anger baked into the space, has something to do with the amygdala's direct involvement. The Guardian of Nightmare Realms presides over the most punishing of the dungeon variants, which seems entirely appropriate for a cosmic entity whose relationship to human ambition and suffering appears to be one of dispassionate oversight. Every hunter who descends into the Chalice Dungeons quickly learns that the most practical reason for going down there is what they can bring back up. Blood gems, those faceted crystalline fragments that can be embedded into hunter weapons to augment their properties, are found in greater quantity and quality the deeper you go into the labyrinth. The best gems, the ones that grant the highest percentage increases to physical damage, the ones that add elemental properties of fire or bolt or arcane, are found only in the deepest sections of the most demanding dungeons. This is a mechanical reality of the game, and it serves to motivate exploration of content that might otherwise feel optional and disconnected. But blood gems are also lore objects, and as with everything in Bloodborne, what they are as lore objects is more interesting and more disturbing than what they are as gameplay items. Blood gems are, at their most fundamental level, crystallized versions of the properties, inherent in different kinds of blood. They are blood that has been under sufficient pressure, in sufficient proximity to the Great One's essence, for sufficient time that it has solidified into a mineral-like state while retaining the supernatural properties of the original fluid. They are blood made permanent, blood made holdable, blood made transferable in a way that liquid blood is not. The shapes of the blood gems, radial, waning, triangular, circular, and the rare droplet shape, correspond to the slots available in different types of weapons. A sword that was designed to channel physical power has radial slots. A weapon designed for transformations that include longer-reaching forms has waning slots. The weapons and the gems were designed together by craftsmen who understood both the physical engineering of the weapon and the supernatural properties of the gems that would enhance them. This is a highly sophisticated and highly specific technology, and it did not emerge from Yharnam. It was inherited, along with everything else, from the Pthumerian civilization whose ruins yield the gems. The deeper you go, the older the blood that crystallized into gems. The strongest gems come from the deepest layers, where the concentration of Great One essence is highest, and where the blood has been sitting, hardening, accruing its properties for the longest time. When a hunter finds a powerful blood gem in the deepest layer of the cursed Pthumeru Hill dungeon, they are holding something that has been forming since before Yharnam existed, since before the Healing Church existed, since before Bergenworth discovered the old labyrinth. They are holding the crystallized residue of the oldest contact between humanity and the Great Ones, turned by time into something a hunter can slot into a weapon and carry into battle. The cursed blood gems deserve particular attention. These are gems that carry what the game explicitly calls curses, properties that are actively negative alongside the positive enhancements. A cursed gem might grant a significant increase to physical damage, while also causing the weapon to constantly lose durability, degrading with every use. Another might increase critical hit damage dramatically while making all other attacks weaker. The curses are embedded in the gems themselves, products of the defilement that the Pthumerian dungeons were punished with. The Great One's displeasure crystallized alongside whatever positive properties the blood carried. This means that when a hunter uses a cursed gem, they are literally wielding cosmic anger. They are incorporating the punishment for ancient transgressions into their weapons. The enhanced damage they gain comes packaged with whatever negative consequence reflects the nature of the transgression that caused the defilement in the first place. Nothing in Bloodborne's world is provided without cost. Even improvement is balanced against diminishment, and the most powerful improvements are balanced against the most significant diminishments. The farming of blood gems, the deliberate and repeated descent into the dungeon system to find better and better gems, is an activity that mirrors the healing church's own relationship to the dungeons. The church sends tomb prospectors to bring back blood and knowledge. The hunter sends themselves to bring back gems and echoes. Both are using the dungeon as a resource extraction operation, taking from the ancient space what can be used above ground, treating the tomb of a civilization as a supply depot. Both are participating in exactly the kind of relationship with the old labyrinth that the Pthumerian civilization itself demonstrated was ultimately unsustainable. There is something uncomfortable in that recognition for a player who has spent hours grinding chalice dungeons for the best possible gems. The motivation is understandable. You want to optimize your build. You want to be more effective in combat. You want the most powerful version of your weapon. These are reasonable goals, but the means of achieving them involves exactly the same extractive logic that characterizes every civilization's relationship with the dungeon. Take what is useful, leave the rest. Ignore the question of what the taking costs. The pearl slugs that appear throughout the old labyrinth are described as clear signs of the left-behind Great Ones. These are small creatures, organic and strange, found in the nooks and crannies of the dungeon passages. They are not dangerous. They are, their humble way, part of the living ecology of a space that has been occupied by Great One presence for so long that even the incidental life forms that evolved within it carry traces of that presence. Using pearl slugs as ritual materials in the chalice creation process means feeding a piece of the Great One's residual presence back into the ritual that grants access to the spaces where that presence is strongest. It is circular. It is self-perpetuating. The dungeon system feeds itself with pieces of its own history. The tomb mold that grows on the surfaces of the dungeon walls is similar, a fungal substance presumably, though in a space where the physical rules have been altered by millennia of Great One proximity, the definition of fungal becomes complicated. Tomb mold used in ritual purposes connects the hunter to the biological substrate of the dungeon itself, to the material reality of the space they are entering. You are not just performing an abstract ritual, you are incorporating the dungeon into the ritual. You are using the dungeon to open the dungeon which sounds circular, because it is circular, because the entire system is circular, because circularity is the fundamental structure of everything Bloodborne is built on. Now that we have travelled through all 4 regions of the old labyrinth, have met the Watchers and the Keepers and the Loran beasts and Ebrietas and Queen Yharnam herself, we need to step back and understand what all of it means together. Because the Chalice Dungeons are not just optional content with interesting enemies and useful items, they are the thesis statement of Bloodborne's entire thematic argument. The game's main story, Yharnam, the Healing Church, the Scourge of Beasts, the Hunt That Never Ends, is a tragedy about a civilization making catastrophic choices in pursuit of transcendence. But it presents itself as a unique tragedy, as something happening for the first time to people who could not have known better. The Chalice Dungeons reveal that this is not true. This has happened before. This has happened multiple times. The cycle is not new. It is ancient. It is the fundamental pattern of what happens when beings with ambition and access to the Great One's blood and the cosmic truth make the choices that ambitious beings always make. Pthumeru made those choices, Loran made those choices, and now Yharnam is making them, following the same path with the same result ahead of it, watched by the same indifferent Great Ones who watched the others fall. The dungeons are a museum of repetition. They show you the before, so that you understand the after that Yharnam is becoming. This is why the line in the Loran Chalice description is so important. Some have made the dreaded extrapolation that Yharnam will be next. Someone in Yharnam knew. Someone looked at Loran's ruins, understood the pattern, and spoke the conclusion aloud. The dreaded extrapolation. Dreaded because it was obvious. Dreaded because knowing it changed nothing. Dreaded because the institutions of Yharnam had too much invested in the old blood to stop, even when confronted with evidence of exactly where that investment led. The Pthumerians were guardians who became worshippers, who became blood ministers, who became beasts. Loran was a civilization that found the blood without the cosmic context, and was destroyed by it even faster than Pthumeru. Yharnam is the Healing Church's civilization, built on Pthumerian ruins, using Pthumerian techniques, heading toward the Pthumerian ending with full knowledge of what that ending looks like. And the scholars of Bergenworth, who first brought the dungeon knowledge to the surface, set this cycle in motion for what we can only hope was the last time, though nothing in the game's cosmology suggests that it was. The chalices themselves are objects of interest in this light. They are described as holy objects, as relics, as things that became objects of worship in the Pthumerian civilization. They are also tools, practical keys to the labyrinth, ritualistic cups filled with specific materials to break specific seals. The duality is appropriate. The sacred and the practical are inseparable in the world of the dungeons, just as they are inseparable in the Healing Church above them. Blood is holy. Blood is medicine. Blood is the source of the transformation that destroys you. All of these things simultaneously, with no contradiction, because the world of Bloodborne does not believe that things have only one meaning or only one function. What is the moral of the Chalice Dungeons? What does all of this darkness, all of this tragedy layered upon tragedy, all of this evidence of the pattern that cannot be broken, what does it tell us? Perhaps it tells us that the desire to transcend, to become more than we are, to reach past the limits of our mortal nature and touch something divine, is not something that can be suppressed by knowledge of its consequences. The Pthumerians knew what the old blood was doing to them. Loran knew. The scholars of Bergenworth knew, at least some of them, and they continued anyway, because the promise of transcendence is more compelling than the fear of consequence to beings who believe deeply enough in the possibility of success. Perhaps it tells us that civilizations do not learn from the ruins of other civilizations, even when those ruins are located directly beneath their own foundations, even when the pattern is explicit, even when someone has written it down and said openly, Yharnam will be next. The knowledge of the cycle is not sufficient to break it. Or perhaps, and this is the reading that feels most true to what the dungeons actually show us, the chalice. Dungeons tell us that the cycle is not simply a product of human foolishness or ambition. The cycle is part of the design. The great ones allow it, or cause it, or need it in ways that their inscrutable natures make impossible for human minds to fully grasp. Queen Yharnam was chosen for a blood contract. The child of that contract became Murgo. The school of Mensis sought Murgo out. The nightmares were created. The hunter arrived. All of it unfolding with the inexorable quality of something that has happened before and will happen again, with or without the participation of any individual human being who tries to resist or divert it. The Chalice Dungeons do not offer hope. They offer context, and sometimes context the understanding that you are part of something much larger and much older than your own moment in it is both more and less comforting than hope. There is a category of enemy in the Chalice Dungeons that does not exist in Yharnam's surface world, and whose presence in the labyrinth tells us something specific and deeply unsettling about what prolonged exposure to the old labyrinth does to ordinary human minds. These are the forgotten madmen. The forgotten madmen are hunters, or they were hunters. The equipment they carry, the transformed weapons, the hunter garb, the fighting techniques that still echo the disciplined training of a workshop education, all confirm that these were people who descended into the dungeons on behalf of someone, whether the Healing Church or Bergenworth or some private expedition, and who never came back. Not because they died, but because the dungeons took something from them that could not be recovered, and what remained was insufficient for return. The madman's knowledge item, dropped by various enemies in the dungeons and also found throughout Yharnam, describes itself as a desiccated skull, from which madness springs. Use it, and you gain 1 point of insight, the cosmic awareness that comes from exposure to Great One truth. The skull belonged to someone who accumulated enough insight in the wrong way too fast, without the spiritual preparation that might have allowed them to integrate what they were perceiving. The knowledge they gained dried out the vessel that held it, leaving something hollow and brittle that shatters into the very insight it contained. The forgotten madmen have been in the dungeons long enough that the insight they have accumulated, the cosmic awareness that has been flooding into their consciousness from proximity to Great One spaces, has broken their capacity to function as rational beings. They fight wildly, without the controlled technique of their original training reasserting itself, all muscle memory and no strategy. Their attacks are fast and unpredictable precisely because the calculating mind that once directed them has been overwhelmed by something it could not contain. And this is the thing about insight in Bloodborne. It is not simply awareness, it is burden. Every point of insight you accumulate as the player character changes something. At very high levels of insight, the world becomes demonstrably different. These sounds are wrong. The presence of the amygdalas on the buildings becomes visible. The doll in the hunter's dream becomes animate. Reality becomes less stable, less solid, less reliable as a framework for understanding experience. These changes reflect what is happening to the player character's consciousness. It is expanding, accommodating new information about the true nature of the world, and that expansion comes with instability. The forgotten madmen are what happens when that instability wins. When the expansion of consciousness exceeds the capacity of the consciousness to maintain itself, they have seen too much. In spaces where the barrier between the physical world and the cosmic dimension is at its thinnest, and the seeing has undone them, they are still technically alive, still capable of violence, still hunting in a degraded and purposeless way. But whatever made them hunters, whatever gave their hunting a direction and a meaning, has been scoured away by an excess of truth. There is something in the forgotten madmen that the Mensis scholars should have heeded more carefully. The Mensis ritual, that catastrophic attempt at direct Great One communion that destroyed the minds of everyone who participated, was essentially a faster, more concentrated version of what the dungeons do to people who stay too long. The scholars wanted to force the insight that the dungeons gradually impose. They wanted to receive all at once what the forgotten madmen received incrementally over years of dungeon exploration. The result was predictably worse than gradual madness. The scholars did not become wildly fighting combatants like the madmen. They became the brain of Mensis, a collective consciousness dissolved entirely into something that was no longer individual, no longer human, no longer capable of any form of experience that corresponds to the concept of a person. But the forgotten madmen show that even the gradual version is ultimately the same trajectory. Slower, yes. Survivable for longer, yes. But the direction is the same. Every additional point of insight that the dungeons force into a human mind that was not designed to hold it moves that mind closer to the dissolution that the Mensis scholars achieved in an instant. The dungeons are a slow version of the Mensis ritual, running on every human who enters them and stays too long. This is why the hunter's dream matters so much for the player character's survival. The dream provides a space of relative cosmic distance. It is adjacent to the Great Ones, but not embedded within their most intense presence. When you return to the dream, when you level up and prepare for the next descent, you're in some sense decompressing, allowing the insight you have accumulated to settle. The doll's calm presence, the quiet of the garden, the absence of immediate threat, these are not just narrative comfort. They are structural protection against the accelerating madness that prolonged unbroken dungeon exposure would otherwise cause. The forgotten madmen did not have a hunter's dream, or if they did, they lost access to it, or they went too deep too fast without the breaks that the dream provides. Whatever the specific mechanism, they are the evidence that the dungeon system kills minds as surely as it kills bodies, and that in some ways the death of the mind is worse, because the body continues long after the mind that once directed it has been consumed. Among the most philosophically interesting figures in the entire dungeon system are the Keepers of the Old Lords, and they deserve their own extended meditation, because what they represent goes beyond mere enemy type into something genuinely profound about devotion, sacrifice, and the price of commitment. The Keeper set's description tells us what we need to know, in language that is careful and revealing. These are the oldest of the ancient Pthumerians who gained an eternal life, yet as an ashen form, being a result of a ceremony of flame. The ceremony of flame cremated both body and soul, and the verb there is important. Not only body, not physical matter burned away while consciousness remained. Body and soul together, both aspects of a living being consumed by fire and transformed into something that is neither alive nor dead in any conventional sense. Think about what this means as a choice. The Pthumerians who became keepers chose this. They entered the ceremony willingly, understanding that they would be changed fundamentally, that their ordinary existence would end and something else would begin, something eternal and ashen and fire-sustained. They made this sacrifice for a purpose, to become eternal guardians of the Great Ones who slept in the deepest places, to ensure that even if the civilization itself collapsed, even if every living member of Pthumerian society was gone, there would still be something watching over the sacred spaces, something that could not age, could not tire, could not be driven away by the passage of ordinary time. They achieved exactly what they intended. Here they still are thousands of years later, walking the corridors, tending the eternal fires, protecting chambers that may contain nothing any more worth protecting. Their civilization is dust. The Great Ones they were set to watch over have either departed, changed, or become indifferent. The purpose that drove the original sacrifice has been emptied of its meaning by the passage of an unimaginable amount of time, and the Keepers persist because they built themselves to persist, because the very act that made them eternal removed the capacity to stop. There is something deeply melancholy in the internal fire that burns continuously through a Keeper's body without ever consuming it. Fire is typically transformative. Fire destroys and purifies and changes things. But the Keeper's fire has been burning for so long that it has lost its transformative quality. It is fire that has forgotten how to finish what fire starts. It burns and burns and burns and nothing changes, because there is nothing left to change, because the ceremony already took everything the fire could take, and now the fire has only itself. The Keeper's fire also illuminates the dungeons. Literally, Sakul, the Keepers carry torches, walk with a glow that pushes back the surrounding dark. In the absence of any other light source, the Keepers are the light. Guardians who have become necessary to the very corridors they protect. Their continued burning providing illumination to spaces that would otherwise be entirely lightless. Perhaps the Great Ones intended this. Perhaps it is coincidence. Perhaps it simply happened the way that things which persist long enough become structurally embedded in the world around them, until removing them would leave a gap that was not there before they arrived. When you fight a Keeper, there is a moment, if you watch carefully, if you're not entirely focused on surviving the encounter, when you can see the quality of their movement. It is ancient. It is practiced in the way that something practiced for millennia becomes practiced, not through continued drilling, but through the settling of motion into its absolute most efficient form. A Keeper has fought exactly like this thousands of times. Every swing of their torch is the distillation of every swing that came before it, refined by eternity into pure expression of the gesture without any wasted motion remaining. They are in their horrible way perfect, and they are perfectly alone. There is a mechanical aspect to the Chalice Dungeons that deserves lore consideration, because in Bloodborne nothing is purely mechanical. The process by which a hunter creates a Chalice Dungeon, standing at a ritual altar in the hunter's dream and combining a chalice with specific materials, is a genuinely ritualistic act that connects directly to Pthumerian practices thousands of years old. The materials required vary by dungeon type and depth, but the categories are illuminating. Ritual blood, a general purpose offering. Tomb mould, the substance of the dungeon's physical presence. Pearl slugs, described as clear signs of the left-behind Great Ones who reside in the labyrinth. Bastards of Loran, those horrifying mummified infant bodies of transformed Loranians. Red jelly, a substance that appears in the deepest Pthumerian dungeons and is connected to the biological remnants of Great One presence. Blood echoes, the experiential, developed this system over generations of communion with the Great Ones, refining the specific combinations required to access specific sections of the labyrinth, encoding the knowledge in the chalices themselves so that anyone who held the right chalice and gathered the right materials could access the corresponding section of the old underground network. The additional rites are particularly interesting. The fetid offering, which requires specific materials and makes enemies more challenging but increases rewards. The rotted offering, which requires different materials and calls the Witch of Hemwick's eye collector cousins into the dungeon as roaming enemies. The cursed rite, which cuts the hunter's health in half but produces cursed blood gems as drops. These are not merely gameplay modifiers, they are ritual conditions, specific alterations to the nature of the space being created that change what that space contains and what it demands of those who enter it. Angering the Watchers makes them more treacherous. Rotting the dungeon draws rot-associated entities. Cursing the dungeon produces the physical diminishment that represents cosmic displeasure. The ritual system is a remnant of Pthumerian knowledge that the Healing Church learned to use without fully understanding. They knew the materials, they knew the combinations, but whether they understood what was actually happening when they performed these rituals, whether they grasped that they were continuing ancient practices devised for purposes only the original practitioners fully comprehended, is unclear. The Church is very good at performing rituals and very poor at understanding why those rituals produce what they produce. This is perhaps a fair description of institutional religion in general. We have been underground for a long time. Now let us bring what we have learned upward into the streets of Yharnam and see what the Chalice Dungeons tell us about the city built above them. The first thing they tell us is that the name of the city is itself a memorial. Yharnam was named after the Pthumerian queen whose body lies at the bottom of the deepest dungeon. The Healing Church, when they established the city, chose to honour, or at least acknowledge, the civilization they had built upon by naming their new creation after its last ruler. This is either a gesture of respect or a gesture of appropriation, depending on how you read it. They took the name of the civilization whose secrets they were exploiting and put it on the exploitation itself. The city of Yharnam is built on the tomb of the Pthumerian civilization, and it wears that civilization's queen's name like a borrowed coat. The blood ministration that the Healing Church offers its citizens is Pthumerian in origin. The specific techniques were refined by Lawrence and his scholars, but the substance, the old blood from the depths, was flowing through Pthumerian veins thousands of years before it flowed through Yharnam's. every vial of blood that changes hands in Cathedral Ward, every ceremony of healing that the church performs, every miracle of recovery that draws pilgrims from across the world to seek the healing church's help, all of it originates in those ancient corridors, in the blood of beings who have been dead for millennia, in practices devised by a civilization that died precisely because of those practices. The scourge of beasts is not new to Yharnam. It is the same scourge that destroyed Loran. It is the same corruption that the oldest Pthumerian dungeons show evidence of. The beast in every citizen who has received blood ministration is not Yharnam's unique problem. It is the problem that has been embedded in the old blood since before anyone living can remember the fundamental consequence of human contact with the Great One's biological essence. Yharnam is not exceptional. Yharnam is latest. The undead watchers who still patrol the dungeons and who still expand the Hintertombs are the ultimate evidence of what awaits any civilization that becomes so deeply invested in a system that it cannot stop even after the reason for the system has ceased to exist. They dig, they guard, they patrol. Because those are the things they were created to do, and no authority has ever told them to stop, and the authority that could have told them no longer exists. Yharnam's citizens on the night of the hunt have something of the Watcher in them. They follow the procedures of the hunt because the hunt is the system, and the system continues, even after any meaningful reason for it has been consumed by the very corruption the system was meant to contain. And the Great Ones, who sleep in the deepest places, or who drift in the cosmic dimension that is borders, or who have departed entirely and left Ebrietas behind as the sole mourner of their departure, these beings are not new to Yharnam either. They were here before Yharnam. They were here before Loran. They were here when the Pthumerians were simple guardians, before the guardians became supplicants. The Great One's relationship to human civilization is not something that began with the Healing Church's founding or with Bergenworth's exploration. It is as old as the labyrinth, as old as the blood, as old as the desire, persistent across every civilization that has ever discovered the truth of their existence, to reach upward and touch something that exists infinitely above the reaching. We have travelled far tonight, farther than most hunters go, through the Pthumerian corridors where undead soldiers patrol millennia-old orders, through the burning passages of Loran where the scourge ran unchecked until it swallowed a civilization whole, through the cosmic border of Isz where Ebrietas mourns in the dark, to the deepest chamber of Pthumeru, a hill where a queen in a blood-stained wedding dress waits for a child she was never allowed to keep. The Chalice Dungeons are Bloodborne's memory. The game's surface story, the night of the hunt, the healing church, the scourge, the Great Ones, the endings, is the present tense of a tragedy that the dungeons reveal has a very long past tense. The cycle did not begin with Lawrence or Master Willem or the founding of the healing church. It began with the Pthumerians. It continued with Loran. It is continuing now in Yharnam, and nothing we have seen in the dungeon suggests it will end here. This is Bloodborne's deepest and most unsettling observation. Not that humanity makes mistakes, but that humanity makes the same mistakes repeatedly, across civilizations, across thousands of years, across the complete and available evidence of what those mistakes produce. The dungeons are not hidden. The healing church knows they exist. They send their own explorers down there. They use the materials found within them. They built their most important rituals on knowledge derived from them. They named their city after the queen, found at the bottom of the oldest one. They have every piece of the picture they would need to understand where they are headed, and they are headed there anyway. What does it mean to know that the tragedy you are participating in is ancient? What does it mean to be the latest in a line of civilizations that all reached for the same thing and all fell in the same way? Is there something noble in the reaching, even knowing the falling? Or is the reaching itself the problem, the insistence that transcendence must be pursued regardless of cost, the conviction that this time will be different, that this civilization or this scholar or this hunter will be the one who achieves what no one has achieved and does not pay what everyone has paid? The Chalice. Dungeons do not answer these questions. They ask them in stone and darkness and blood, and they ask them very, very quietly, in the way that things written in stone always ask their questions. Not urgently, not desperately, but with the patient certainty of something that has been here long enough to know that the questions will eventually be heard, even if they are not answered. Close your eyes, if they are not already closed. The dungeons are behind you now. The ancient corridors and their ancient guardians and their ancient tragedy are receding into the dark. The surface world of Yharnam waits above, with its gas lamps and its Gothic cathedrals and its hunt that never ends. You know more now than you did before we began. You have seen the bottom of the world that Bloodborne built, and somewhere below Yharnam, in chambers that never see the light, the watchers continue their patrol, and the keepers continue their burning vigil, and Queen Yharnam stands in a memory of the moment before everything was taken from her, and Mergo cries, and Ebrietas mourns, and the cosmos waits beyond the translucent walls of Isz, indifferent and vast and eternal. The dungeons keep their secrets. But now you know. Thank you so much for spending this time with Nightfall lore. If this journey through the depths of Bloodborne's oldest story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to the channel. It means more than you know, and it tells me that these long explorations of the lore that lives in the corners of these extraordinary games are worth the time we spend in them together. If you have thoughts on the Chalice Dungeons, on Queen Yharnam, on what Loran means for the story of Yharnam, or on anything else that caught your attention tonight, I would love to read your thoughts in the comments. Every comment gets read. If you are just discovering Nightfall lore and want more, the complete Bloodborne lore video is a good place to start, and every Bloodborne video on this channel goes deep into different aspects of the world you have been exploring tonight. Sleep well, dream of nothing too cosmic, and may the good blood guide you into rest. But before you fully drift away, let me leave you with one final thought. The Chalice Dungeons are optional. You do not have to go there to complete Bloodborne's main story. You can experience everything the game has to offer on the surface and never once descend into those ancient corridors. And perhaps there is a version of the player's journey that mirrors the version of Yharnam's citizens, who never think about what is beneath their feet, who receive their blood ministration and live their lives without ever asking where the blood comes from, what civilization produced it, what warning it carries. But those players, like those citizens, miss the full picture. They experience the consequences without the cause. They see the tragedy without the history that makes the tragedy legible. The Chalice Dungeons are optional in the same way that understanding the past is optional. Technically, yes, you can proceed without it. but something fundamental about the meaning of the present is only visible when you have looked at the deep past long enough to recognize the pattern. The dungeons are Bloodborne's past, and without the past, the tragedy of Yharnam is just tragedy. With it, the tragedy is warning, and the difference between those two things is the difference between suffering that is merely experienced and suffering that is understood. The dungeons keep their secrets, but now you know. Thank you so much for spending this time with Nightfall lore. If this journey through the depths of Bloodborne's oldest story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to the channel. It means more than you know, and it tells me that these long explorations of the lore that lives in the corners of these extraordinary games are worth the time we spend in them together. If you have thoughts on the Chalice Dungeons, on Queen Yharnam, on what Loran means for the story of Yharnam, or on anything else that caught your attention tonight, I would love to read your thoughts in the comments. Every comment gets read. If you are just discovering Nightfall lore and want more, the complete Bloodborne lore video is a good place to start, and every Bloodborne video on this channel goes deep into different aspects of the world you have been exploring tonight. Sleep well, dream of nothing too cosmic, and may the good blood guide you into rest. Good night, good hunter.